The autumn air was crisp that evening in 1956 when the black sedan rolled into the small town of Millbrook. Inside sat Alessandro Romano, a man whose fingers had graced the finest concert halls across Europe. His performances had been praised in newspapers from Vienna to London. Tonight he was here in this tiny farming community, and he wasn't particularly happy about it. The town had just finished building their first proper cultural center, a modest brick building that the locals were immensely proud of. To celebrate its opening, they had somehow convinced Alessandro to perform. The fee was generous, though not nearly what he usually commanded. Still, money was money, and a performance was a performance, even if it meant playing for people who probably couldn't tell Mozart from a radio jingle. Before the concert, the mayor had insisted on hosting a small reception at his home. Alessandro found himself standing in a parlor filled with the town's most prominent citizens. Farmers in their Sunday best, the local doctor, the school teacher, the bank manager, all of them looking at him with a mixture of awe and nervousness, as if he were some exotic bird that had accidentally landed in their backyard. Alessandro accepted a glass of wine and immediately began holding court. He spoke loudly about his recent tour of Italy, dropping names of famous composers and conductors. He described the magnificent theaters where he had performed, the standing ovations, the flowers thrown onto the stage. The locals nodded politely, though most of them had never traveled farther than the neighboring county. "You know," Alessandro said, swirling his wine dramatically, "real music is becoming a lost art. Everywhere I go, I see this decline. People are content with their little radios and their simple songs. They don't understand what it takes to truly master an instrument. The dedication, the sacrifice, the years of training." The mayor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, we do have some fine musicians here in Millbrook. Several folks play piano at our church every Sunday." Alessandro let out a short laugh that wasn't quite kind. "Playing hymns is not the same as understanding music, my friend. Any child can be taught to press keys in the right order. But to feel the music, to breathe life into it, that requires something else entirely. Something I doubt most people in towns like this have ever experienced." An awkward silence fell over the room. The mayor's wife busied herself refilling glasses. The doctor suddenly found his shoes fascinating. And in the corner, standing quietly beside her husband, was Margaret Sullivan. Margaret was 43 years old, though she could have passed for younger. She wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. Her hands, resting on her husband's arm, were calloused from gardening and farm work. She had the kind of face that people rarely noticed at first glance, but once you looked closer, you could see a depth in her eyes that spoke of stories untold. Her husband, Thomas, was a good man, a farmer who worked from sunrise to sunset, whose hands were even more weathered than hers. He loved Margaret with a quiet, steady devotion that had sustained them through 20 years of marriage. Right now he could feel her discomfort at this gathering, could sense how out of place she felt among these people in their fancy clothes, listening to this arrogant man from the city. Alessandro's gaze swept across the room and landed on the piano that stood against the far wall. It was an old upright, probably 30 years old, but well-maintained. The mayor's wife played it occasionally, teaching the neighborhood children their scales. "Ah, a piano," Alessandro exclaimed as if discovering buried treasure. He strode over to it and lifted the lid, running his fingers across the keys without actually pressing them. "When was this last tuned?" "Actually, don't answer that. Let me show you all what real piano playing sounds like." Without waiting for permission, he sat down and launched into a complex piece by Liszt. His fingers flew across the keys with remarkable speed and precision. The notes cascaded through the room like a waterfall. Technically, it was flawless. Every trill was perfect. Every crescendo was exactly calculated. The townspeople watched in genuine amazement, because whatever else Alessandro might be, he was undeniably talented. When he finished, the room burst into enthusiastic applause. Alessandro stood and took an exaggerated bow, clearly pleased with himself. "You see," he said, his voice carrying that edge of superiority again, "that is how a piano should be played. That is what years of proper training accomplishes. I started learning when I was 4 years old. 4! My teachers were the finest in Europe. I have dedicated my entire life to this craft." He walked back to the center of the room, and something in his posture suggested he wasn't finished showing off. In fact, Alessandro continued, warming to his theme, I would venture to say that probably no one in this room, besides myself, could play even a simple scale properly. Am I wrong? Has anyone here studied music seriously? Real music, I mean. Not just church hymns or folk songs. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. Now, Alessandro, I'm sure several people here could. No, I'm serious, Alessandro interrupted. And now there was a challenge in his voice. I'll tell you what. If anyone here, anyone at all, can sit at that piano and play just one piece competently, just one piece that shows real understanding of music, I will donate half of tonight's concert earnings to your local school for their music program. How's that for an offer? The room went completely silent. People glanced at each other nervously. The mayor's wife could play a little, but she knew she was nowhere near good enough to meet Alessandro's standard. The schoolteacher played accordion, not piano. A few others had taken lessons as children but had long since forgotten everything they learned. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Alessandro smiled, knowing he had proven his point. These were good people, perhaps, but they were simple people. They knew nothing of art, nothing of the dedication required for true musical excellence. That's when Thomas Sullivan felt his wife's hand tighten on his arm. He looked down at Margaret and saw something in her face he hadn't seen in 20 years. Fear, yes, but also something else, something that looked almost like longing. Margaret? He whispered so quietly that only she could hear. She shook her head slightly, but Thomas knew his wife. In all their years together, she had never spoken much about her life before they met. He knew she had grown up in California. He knew her parents had died when she was young. He knew she had moved to the Midwest to start over. But there had always been gaps in her story, spaces she never filled in, and he had loved her enough not to push. But he had also noticed things over the years. The way her fingers sometimes moved when music played on the radio, as if remembering something. The way she would stop and listen, completely absorbed whenever she heard a piano. The way she had cried just once when they passed a music store in the city and she saw a grand piano in the window. You should do it, Thomas whispered, his voice gentle but encouraging. Thomas. No, I can't. It's been too long. Margaret, I don't know what you're afraid of, but I know that man needs to be put in his place, and I have a feeling you're the one who can do it. She looked up at her husband, this good man who had given her a peaceful life, who had never asked about the shadows in her past, and she saw in his eyes complete trust, complete faith in her even though he didn't fully understand what he was asking. Margaret took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. Then, before she could change her mind, she stepped forward. I'll try, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every head in the room turned to look at her. Alessandro's eyebrows rose in surprise, and then his mouth curved into a smile that was almost cruel. This farm woman in her homemade dress, with her calloused hands and nervous expression, thought she could play? This was going to be entertaining. By all means, Alessandro said, gesturing grandly toward the piano. Please, show us what you can do. Margaret walked toward the piano on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting. The townspeople knew her as a quiet woman, a good neighbor who brought vegetables from her garden and helped with church socials. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. Neither did Alessandro. Neither, really, did Margaret herself. As she sat down on the piano bench, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys, 20 years of silence was about to come to an end. Margaret sat at the piano bench, and suddenly the room felt impossibly small. Every eye was on her. She could feel Alessandro standing behind her, arms crossed, that smug smile still on his face. She could hear Thomas breathing somewhere in the crowd, could sense his quiet support even though he had no idea what he had just asked her to do. Her hands hovered over the keys. They were shaking. Not just from nervousness, though there was plenty of that. They were shaking because touching these keys meant touching a part of herself she had buried so deep, she had almost convinced herself it never existed. 20 years. It had been 20 years since she had really played. As her fingers found their positions on the cool ivory keys, memories came flooding back like a dam had burst inside her mind. She wasn't in the mayor's parlor anymore. She was 8 years old, sitting in a cramped apartment above a laundry in San Francisco's Chinatown. Her mother was there, standing beside her, one hand resting gently on her small shoulder. "Again, May," her mother said softly. That was her name then, Machen, before she became Margaret, before she became someone else entirely. "Mama, my fingers hurt," little May had complained. "I know, baby, but you have a gift. A real gift. Your teacher says he's never seen a child pick up music so quickly. We can't let that gift go to waste." Her father worked 16 hours a day at a restaurant kitchen. Her mother took in sewing, her fingers flying through fabric late into the night. Every penny they saved went toward May's piano lessons. Every sacrifice they made was for her future. By the time she was 12, May was playing pieces that most adults struggled with. Her teacher, an elderly Russian man who had fled his country decades before, would sometimes get tears in his eyes when she played. "You don't just play the notes, May," he would tell her. "You understand them. That cannot be taught. That is something you're born with." At 15, she was accepted into the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, one of the youngest students they had ever admitted. Her parents threw a celebration dinner, inviting every family they knew from the neighborhood. Her father made a speech in broken English about the American dream, about how anything was possible in this country if you worked hard enough. "Our daughter will be famous one day," he had said, his voice thick with pride and emotion. "She will play in the great concert halls. She will make beautiful music for the world." Margaret's fingers pressed down on the keys now, not making sound yet, just feeling the familiar resistance. In the mayor's parlor, Alessandro shifted impatiently. "Anytime you're ready," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. But Margaret was still lost in the past. She was 19 now in her memory. It was a cold February night and she was practicing for her senior recital. This recital was important. Scouts would be there from orchestras across the country. Her teacher believed she would get offers, believed she would have her pick of opportunities. Everything her parents had worked for was about to pay off. She had been at the conservatory's practice rooms until late, working on a particularly difficult passage. When she finally packed up and headed home, it was nearly midnight. She remembered feeling tired but happy, remembered humming the melody as she walked toward the bus stop. Then she saw the smoke. Even from blocks away, she could see it rising into the night sky, thick and black. She started running, her piano bag banging against her hip. Please no. Please God no. Not that street. Not that building, but it was that building. The apartment above her family's laundry was engulfed in flames. Fire trucks were already there, firefighters shouting, hoses spraying water that seemed to do nothing against the inferno. Neighbors stood in clusters on the sidewalk, some crying, some just staring in shock. May pushed through the crowd, screaming for her parents. A firefighter caught her, held her back as she struggled and screamed. "My parents are in there. My mama and Baba are in there. I'm sorry," the firefighter said, and the way he said it told her everything she needed to know. They never made it out. Her father, exhausted from his double shift, had fallen asleep smoking a cigarette. That's what the investigators said later. One careless moment after years of careful living and everything was gone. Her parents, their home, the laundry business they had built from nothing. All of it, just smoke and ash. Margaret's hands were fully on the keys now. In the parlor, the crowd was getting restless. Someone coughed. The mayor's wife whispered something to her neighbor. Alessandro checked his pocket watch with an exaggerated sigh. But Margaret was still in the past, standing at a funeral with almost no one there. Her parents had worked so hard they hadn't had time to make many close friends. The few family members they had were scattered across the country, too far away or too poor to travel for a funeral. May stood alone at the graveside, wearing a borrowed black dress, feeling emptier than she had known it was possible to feel. The conservatory gave her time off, of course. They were understanding. "Take as long as you need," they said. "We're here for you when you're ready to come back. Your senior recital can wait." But May never went back. She couldn't. Every time she sat at a piano, all she could think about was her parents. All she could see was her father's proud face at that celebration dinner. All she could hear was her mother's voice saying, "You have a gift," over and over again. The piano wasn't music anymore. It was guilt. It was grief. It was a monument to everything she had lost and everything she could never give back to them. They had sacrificed everything for her music, and now they weren't here to see what it had been for. What was the point? What was any of it for? So Machen disappeared. She left San Francisco with the little money she had scraped together. She moved east, then further east, putting distance between herself and that life. She stopped in small towns, worked odd jobs, kept moving. Eventually, she ended up in Millbrook, a place so far from everything she knew that it felt like another planet. She met Thomas at a church social. He was kind and steady, a man who had never been more than 50 miles from where he was born. He knew nothing about music or cities or the weight of unfulfilled dreams. He asked her to dance, and she said yes because he had an honest face and gentle eyes, and seemed like he belonged to a world that made sense. When he asked about her past, she kept it simple. She was from California. Her parents had passed. She wanted a fresh start. He accepted this without pushing, and she loved him for that acceptance. She loved him for being content with a simple life, for not asking her to be anything other than who she was in that moment. They got married 6 months later. She became Margaret Sullivan, farmer's wife. She learned to can vegetables and mend fences and collect eggs from chickens. She planted a garden that became the envy of the county. She made friends with the neighbors and helped organize church bake sales. She built a quiet, peaceful life with a good man who loved her, and she never touched a piano. Not once in 20 years until now. Margaret took a deep breath. The memories were still swirling in her mind, but she was back in the present now, fully aware of where she was and what she was about to do. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something had settled inside her, some decision made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She looked at the keys and suddenly she knew exactly what she was going to play. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was one of the hardest pieces in classical piano repertoire, something that even professional pianists approached with respect and caution. It was the piece she had been working on that night, the night her parents died. The piece she had never finished learning. It was probably insane to attempt it now after 20 years in front of an audience, with an arrogant maestro waiting to humiliate her. But somehow it felt right. It felt like something she needed to do, not for Alessandro, not even for Thomas or the townspeople watching, but for herself, for her parents, for the girl she used to be. Alessandro was opening his mouth to say something else, probably another sarcastic comment about how long she was taking. But before he could speak, Margaret's fingers came down on the keys, and the first notes of the ballade rang out into the stunned silence of the mayor's parlor, and everything changed. The first few notes were tentative. Her fingers stumbled slightly over a chord change. Alessandro's smile widened. "See," his expression said. "I knew this would be embarrassing for her." But then something extraordinary began to happen. Margaret's fingers remembered. Not just the mechanics of playing, though those came back too. Muscle memory awakening from a long sleep. But they remembered something deeper. They remembered what it felt like to disappear into music, to let it flow through her like she was just a channel for something bigger than herself. The tentative notes grew stronger, more confident. The stumbles smoothed out, and then the music began to soar. It filled every corner of that small parlor. It wrapped around every person there and pulled them in. The conversation stopped. The whispers died. Even Alessandro's smile began to fade as he realized that what he was hearing was not the fumbling of an amateur. This was something else entirely. Margaret played, and 20 years of silence poured out through her fingers. 20 years of grief she had never properly processed. 20 years of love for parents who never got to see her succeed. 20 years of a dream deferred, buried but never quite dead. The music swelled and dipped, soft passages giving way to thunderous crescendos. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who hadn't played in 2 decades. But more than the technical skill, more than the perfect notes, was the feeling in it. This wasn't a performance. This was a confession. This was a prayer. This was goodbye and hello and forgiveness all wrapped up in Chopin's complex, beautiful composition. Alessandro stood frozen, his arms slowly falling to his sides. His mouth had gone slack. He was staring at Margaret's hands like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, what he was hearing. This farm woman, this nobody from a nowhere town, was playing like someone who had devoted their entire life to music. Because she had devoted her life to it, right up until the moment it became too painful to continue. The mayor's wife had tears streaming down her face. The doctor had closed his eyes, lost in the sound. Thomas stood with his hand over his heart, watching his wife with wonder and sudden understanding dawning on his face. This was who she had been. This was the part of herself she had kept hidden. locked away like a treasure too precious and too painful to look at. Margaret played on, and for the first time in 20 years, she felt complete. The music filled the room like water filling a vessel, rising higher and higher until everyone in it felt submerged in sound. Margaret's fingers danced across the keys, and with each passing measure, something inside her continued to unlock. She had forgotten how this felt, or maybe she hadn't forgotten. Maybe she had just convinced herself that she could live without it. The way you convince yourself you can live without something that once meant everything. But now playing again, she realized how much of herself she had buried along with that old life. The piece was coming back to her in waves. Passages she thought she had forgotten emerged perfectly from her fingers. The difficult runs that had given her trouble even as a trained student now flowed like she had been practicing them every day for the past 20 years. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Alessandro moved closer to the piano. His expression had completely transformed. The arrogance was gone. The smugness had evaporated. He was watching Margaret's hands with the intensity of someone witnessing something they can't quite believe. His trained ear caught every nuance, every subtle shading, every perfectly executed trill. This wasn't just competent playing. This was exceptional playing, but it was more than that. Alessandro had heard hundreds of pianists in his career. He had performed alongside some of the greatest musicians in the world. He knew technical brilliance when he heard it. What Margaret was playing was technically brilliant, yes, but there was something else in it that made his chest tighten. She was playing with her whole life. Every note carried weight. Every phrase had meaning. The soft passages weren't just quiet. They were tender, almost fragile, like something precious that might break. The loud passages weren't just forceful. They were full of years of pent-up emotion finally being released. This was what he had been searching for in his own playing and had never quite found. This depth, this authenticity, this connection between the music and the soul of the person playing it. The mayor had forgotten about being a host. He simply stood there, transfixed. His wife was still crying, but she was smiling too, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was hearing. The schoolteacher had pulled out a handkerchief and was dabbing at her eyes. Even the men in the room, farmers and businessmen who would normally never admit to being moved by classical music, stood perfectly still, caught in the spell Margaret was weaving. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off his wife. He was seeing her as if for the first time. 20 years of marriage, and he had never known this part of her existed. All those quiet evenings on the porch, all those simple meals at the kitchen table, all those nights lying beside her in bed. And she had been carrying this inside her the whole time. This incredible gift, this whole other life. He felt a surge of love for her that was almost painful. She had given up so much. She had walked away from this extraordinary talent to build a simple life with him. Had she been happy? He had always thought so. She seemed content working in the garden, canning vegetables, mending his shirts. But now he wondered what it had cost her to set this part of herself aside. Margaret played through the middle section of the ballade, where the music becomes more turbulent, more intense. Her fingers attacked the keys with controlled power. The piano seemed to roar under her hands. This was the section that had always challenged her as a student. The timing was tricky. The dynamics had to be exactly right or the whole thing fell apart. But she navigated it perfectly. Better than perfectly. She played it the way someone plays who has lived through real storms, not just musical ones. Someone who knows what it means to lose everything and have to rebuild. Someone who understands that life isn't always beautiful, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth living. Alessandro found himself leaning against the wall for support. He felt something shifting inside him, something fundamental. For years, decades really, he had approached music as a conquest, a way to prove his superiority. He practiced obsessively not because he loved the music, but because he loved being the best at playing it. He performed to dazzle audiences, to collect accolades, to feed his ego. But Margaret wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just playing for the pure sake of letting the music out. And somehow that made it more powerful than anything he had ever done. He thought about his own childhood. The best teachers money could buy. Private tutors. Exclusive conservatories. Every advantage handed to him. His parents had been wealthy, cultured people who saw music as a mark of refinement. They had pushed him toward piano the way other parents might push a child toward medicine or law. A respectable pursuit for a respectable family. He had been good at it. Very good. But had he ever loved it the way Margaret clearly loved it? Had he ever needed it the way she seemed to need it? The music shifted again, moving into the final section. This was where the ballade became almost impossibly complex, where even professional pianists held their breath and hoped to get through without mistakes. Margaret's face was serene now. The fear from earlier was completely gone. She looked almost peaceful, like she had finally found her way home after a very long journey. Her fingers flew through the cascading passages. Not a single wrong note, not a single hesitation. The music built and built, climbing toward the dramatic conclusion. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, and then she played the final haunting chords. The notes hung in the air, resonating, slowly fading into silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence after the music felt almost sacred, like the hush that falls over a church after a profound prayer. Then the room erupted. People started applauding, and it wasn't the polite applause of a formal concert. It was real, enthusiastic. Several people were openly weeping. The mayor's wife was hugging her neighbor. The doctor was shaking his head in amazement. Someone shouted "Bravo," and others joined in. Thomas pushed through the crowd and went to his wife. Margaret stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. She looked dazed, like someone waking from a dream. Thomas wrapped his arms around her and she collapsed against him, suddenly exhausted. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered into her hair. "I couldn't," she whispered back. "It hurt too much to talk about." "I'm so proud of you," he said, and his voice cracked with emotion. So incredibly proud. The applause continued, but Alessandro wasn't clapping. He stood frozen against the wall, his face pale. He was having what could only be described as a crisis of conscience. Everything he thought he knew about music, about himself, about what made someone truly great, was being challenged by what he had just witnessed. This woman had more natural talent in her calloused, work-worn hands than most trained musicians accumulated in a lifetime. And she had set it aside. She had walked away from it, chosen a quiet life on a farm over fame and recognition. How was that possible? How could anyone make that choice unless there was something more important than fame? Unless there was a kind of richness that had nothing to do with concert halls and critical acclaim. Unless he, Alessandro Romano, celebrated pianist, had been chasing the wrong things his entire life. The thought terrified him. Margaret finally pulled away from Thomas and turned to face the crowd. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. People pressed forward, wanting to shake her hand, to tell her how beautiful it was, to ask questions. "Where did you learn? How long did you study? Why have you been hiding this gift?" She answered them quietly, giving simple responses. Yes, she studied in San Francisco. Yes, it had been many years since she played. No, she didn't perform anymore. This was just a one-time thing. Through the crowd, her eyes found Alessandro. He was still standing against the wall, looking like someone who had just witnessed something that fundamentally changed them. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was understanding between them. She saw his shock, his confusion, maybe even his pain. He saw her quiet strength, her dignity, the peace she had made with her choices. Alessandro pushed himself off the wall and walked toward her. The crowd parted for him, sensing something important was about to happen. He stopped in front of Margaret, and to everyone's surprise, he bowed. Not a little nod of the head, but a deep, formal bow, the kind a student gives to a master, the kind one musician gives to another in acknowledgement of their superior skill. When he straightened up, his eyes were glistening. "I have been playing piano for 40 years, he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. "I have performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I have been praised by critics and celebrated by audiences. But in all that time, I have never heard anyone play with the soul that you just showed us." Margaret didn't know what to say. She just nodded slightly, accepting his words. "I made a promise," Alessandro continued. "Half my concert earnings for the music program if anyone could play competently. You have done far more than that. You have humbled me. You have taught me something about music that I should have learned long ago." He paused, seeming to make a decision in that moment. "I'm changing my promise. I'll donate all of tonight's earnings. Every penny. And I'll do more than that. I want to establish a scholarship fund, in your name, for young musicians who have talent but not the means to pursue it." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "No, you don't have to." "Please," Alessandro interrupted gently. Let me do this. I need to do this. You've given me a gift tonight, though you probably don't realize it. Let me give something back. The room burst into applause again. But Margaret was shaking her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Not in my name, she said softly. In my parents' names. Chen Wei and Chen Lin. They were the ones who sacrificed everything for music. They were the ones who believed in it. Alessandro nodded solemnly. The Chen Memorial Scholarship Fund. It will help young musicians for generations to come. He extended his hand to her. Margaret took it. His hand was soft, uncalloused, the hand of someone who had never done hard physical labor. But his grip was firm and sincere. Will you come to my concert tomorrow night? He asked. As my guest of honor? Margaret smiled, but there was sadness in it. Thank you, but no. I played tonight to prove a point. To show you that ordinary people you look down on, might surprise you, but that part of my life is over. I have a different life now. A good life. Alessandro looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He nodded slowly, releasing her hand. I understand. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to play again, you have my card. The world deserves to hear you. The world doesn't need to hear me, Margaret said quietly. But maybe some children in this town need to learn. Maybe I could teach if the school would have me. The school teacher practically leaped forward. Have you? We would be honored. Our music program is almost nothing. We can't pay much, but I don't need much, Margaret said. And she meant it. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, Alessandro stood alone by the piano. He placed his hand on it, feeling the warmth from where Margaret had played. Tomorrow night he would perform for the town. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had anything worth saying. Alessandro couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying Margaret's performance over and over in his mind. Every note, every phrase, every moment of it haunted him in a way that music never had before. He had spent his entire adult life being the best, the most technically skilled, the most celebrated. People paid hundreds of dollars to hear him play. Critics wrote glowing reviews using words like masterful and brilliant and transcendent. But after hearing Margaret play, those words felt hollow, empty, like praise for something that didn't really matter. Around 3 a.m, he got out of bed and sat at the small writing desk by the window. He pulled out a piece of hotel stationery and tried to write down what he was feeling, but words failed him. How do you explain to yourself that you've been doing something wrong for 40 years? How do you admit that maybe, just maybe, you've wasted your life chasing the wrong thing? He thought about his upcoming concert. In just a few hours, he would walk onto that stage and play the same pieces he had played 1,000 times before. The audience would applaud politely. The mayor would shake his hand and thank him for coming. He would collect his fee, get back in his car, and drive to the next town, the next concert, the next performance. But something had changed. He had changed, and he wasn't sure he could go back to performing the way he used to, not after what he had witnessed. Meanwhile, across town at the Sullivan farm, Margaret wasn't sleeping either. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Thomas had gone to bed hours ago, but she was too stirred up to sleep. Playing tonight had opened something inside her that she couldn't just close again. Her hands rested on the table, and she kept looking at them. These hands that gathered eggs and pulled weeds and kneaded bread dough. These same hands had just played Chopin's Ballade without a single mistake after 20 years of silence. How was that possible? She thought about her parents. For years, thinking about them had been too painful, so she had trained herself not to. But tonight, playing their music, she had felt close to them again. She had felt her mother's hand on her shoulder. She had heard her father's proud voice, and instead of the crushing grief she had expected, she had felt something else. Peace, maybe even joy. Can't sleep? Thomas appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up in all directions. Margaret smiled at him. Did I wake you? No. He came and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. I've been lying there thinking. About you. About everything you told me tonight on the drive home. About your parents and the fire and the conservatory. That's a lot to carry around for 20 years. I'm sorry I never told you before. Don't apologize, Thomas said firmly. You told me when you were ready. That's all that matters. He was quiet for a moment, then added, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Margaret's heart clenched. What is it? Have you been happy? Here with me living this life? Or have you been pretending all these years? She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. Thomas Sullivan, I have never pretended with you. Not for one single day. Yes, I gave up music. But I chose to give it up. Nobody forced me. I chose this life. I chose you. And I would choose you again. But don't you miss it? After playing tonight, don't you want to go back to it? Margaret thought about this carefully. I miss it, she admitted. But not the way you might think. I don't miss performing or being on stage or trying to be famous. I never really cared about those things anyway. That was my parents' dream more than mine. What I miss is just playing, making music, feeling that connection to something bigger than myself. Then you should play, Thomas said simply. We'll get a piano. I'll work extra to pay for it. You can play whenever you want. Thomas, pianos are expensive. We can't afford— We'll find a way, he interrupted. Margaret, tonight I watched you come alive in a way I've never seen before. How can I not do everything in my power to help you keep that? She leaned forward and kissed him. This good man who had given her 20 years of steady love and was now offering to give her even more. The next evening, Alessandro stood backstage at the Cultural Center, listening to the crowd settle into their seats. It was a full house. Word had spread about last night's events and people were curious. Some had come to hear the famous Maestro. Others had come hoping Margaret might play again, though he had made it clear she wouldn't be performing. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, which never happened. Alessandro Romano didn't get nervous before concerts. He had played for audiences of thousands. He had performed for royalty. A few hundred people in a small town shouldn't make him anxious, but this was different. Tonight he cared what they thought in a way he had never cared before. He wanted to play for them the way Margaret had played, from the heart, with truth, but he didn't know if he knew how. When he walked onto the stage, the applause was warm. He sat at the grand piano they had brought in specially for the concert and adjusted the bench. He looked out at the audience and spotted familiar faces from last night. The mayor and his wife, the doctor, the school teacher, and there in the back row were Thomas and Margaret. Alessandro felt his chest tighten. She had come after all. He began with a Bach prelude, something he had played so many times he could do it in his sleep. But tonight he tried to approach it differently. He thought about what Margaret had said, about playing to prove a point. He realized that's exactly what he had always done. Every performance was about proving he was the best, proving he deserved the acclaim, proving he was worth the ticket price. But what if he just played? What if he tried to find in the music what Margaret had found? The Bach piece ended and he moved into a Beethoven sonata. Somewhere in the middle of the second movement, something shifted. He stopped thinking about technique. He stopped worrying about what the audience thought. He just let himself feel the music, let it move through him rather than trying to control every aspect of it. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. When he finished the sonata, the applause seemed different somehow, warmer, more genuine, or maybe he was just hearing it differently. The concert continued, and with each piece, Alessandro felt himself letting go a little more, letting go of his ego, his need to impress, his fear of not being perfect. By the time he reached the final piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, he was playing in a way he had never quite played before. The nocturne was beautiful and melancholy, and as he played it, he thought about all the years he had wasted being arrogant and closed off. He thought about Margaret and her quiet dignity, her willingness to walk away from fame for something more meaningful. He thought about all the small-town people he had dismissed over the years, never considering that they might have their own stories, their own depths. When the final note faded, there was a long silence. Then the audience rose to their feet. It wasn't just polite appreciation. It was genuine enthusiasm. They had felt something tonight, and so had he. After the concert, people lined up to thank him. They shook his hand and told him how much they enjoyed it. Alessandro accepted their thanks with uncharacteristic humility. Then he saw Margaret and Thomas making their way toward him. "You played beautifully tonight," Margaret said. "Not as beautifully as you," Alessandro replied. "But I tried. For the first time in my life, I really tried to play from here." He touched his chest over his heart. "I could tell," Margaret said with a smile. It made all the difference. Alessandro took a deep breath. I've been thinking about what you said, about teaching, and about the scholarship fund. I want to do more than just donate money. I want to stay here for a few weeks, teach some classes. Master classes for anyone who wants to learn. I've already spoken to my manager and canceled my next few concerts. The mayor, who had been hovering nearby, nearly dropped his glass. You want to stay here? In Millbrook? Yes, Alessandro said firmly. I think I have more to learn here than I have to teach. But maybe in the process of learning, I can pass something on to others. He turned back to Margaret, and I was hoping you might help me. Co-teach the classes. I can teach technique, but you can teach something I'm still learning. How to play with soul. Margaret looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. She turned back to Alessandro. I'm not a teacher. I've never taught anyone. Neither have I, really, Alessandro admitted. Oh, I've given master classes at conservatories. But I've never actually taught someone to love music. I've only taught them to execute it. There's a difference. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, All right, I'll help, but on one condition. Anything. We teach everyone who wants to learn, not just the talented ones, not just the ones who show promise. Everyone who walks through that door with a genuine desire to make music gets a chance. Alessandro smiled. That's a condition I'm happy to accept. Over the next few days, word spread through Millbrook and the surrounding towns. The famous Maestro was offering free piano lessons at the cultural center. Anyone could come, any age, any skill level. The response was overwhelming. The first class had 40 people crammed into the small room. There were children as young as 6 and adults in their 70s. Some had played before. Many had never touched a piano. They all looked at Alessandro with a mixture of awe and nervousness. Alessandro looked at their faces and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Real purpose. Not the hollow satisfaction of performing for strangers, but the deeper fulfillment of sharing something meaningful with people who genuinely wanted to learn. Margaret stood beside him, and together, they began to teach. Alessandro showed them proper hand position, how to read music, the technical foundations they would need. But Margaret taught them something else. She taught them to listen, to feel, to understand that music wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about expressing something true. One student was a young boy named Danny, maybe 10 years old. His family ran a dairy farm and couldn't afford lessons. He sat at the piano with dirt still under his fingernails from morning chores, and when he played his first simple scale, his face lit up with such pure joy that Alessandro felt tears prick his eyes. This, he thought, this is what music is supposed to be about. Another student was an elderly woman named Ruth who had always wanted to learn piano, but never had the chance. Her arthritic fingers struggled with the keys, but she kept trying, kept practicing. It's never too late, she told Alessandro with a determined smile. That's what your being here taught me. It's never too late to start. Evening after evening, the classes continued. Alessandro had never worked so hard in his life. Teaching was exhausting in a way that performing never was, but it was also more rewarding than anything he had ever done. He watched Margaret with the students and learned from her. She had infinite patience. She never made anyone feel stupid or untalented. She found something to praise in every attempt, no matter how clumsy. And somehow, under her encouragement, people bloomed. One night, after everyone had left and they were straightening up the chairs, Alessandro said to Margaret, "Thank you." For what? For showing me what I was missing. For teaching me that music isn't about being the best. It's about being true. Margaret smiled. You're welcome. But you've taught me something too. What's that? That it's okay to come back. That walking away from something doesn't mean you can never return to it. I thought I had to bury that part of myself forever. But maybe I just needed to find a new way to live with it. They stood there in the quiet room. Two musicians from completely different worlds who had somehow found a way to learn from each other. Outside, the autumn night was cool and clear. In homes across Millbrook, people were practicing their scales, working through simple melodies, discovering the joy of making music. The sound of pianos drifted through open windows, imperfect but earnest. And somewhere in it all, the ghost of Chen Wei and Chen Lin smiled, knowing that their daughter's gift was finally being shared with the world, just not in the way they had imagined. Sometimes the best dreams are the ones that transform into something you never expected. The 4 weeks Alessandro had planned to stay in Millbrook turned into 6. Then 8. His manager called repeatedly, concerned about the concerts being canceled, the money being lost, the opportunities slipping away. But Alessandro kept pushing back his departure date. "I'm not finished here yet," he told his manager during one particularly heated phone call. "There are students who need me." "Students?" His manager sputtered. "Alessandro, you're one of the most sought-after pianists in the world. You have concerts booked in Vienna, in Paris, in London. You can't throw all that away to teach farmers' children how to play chopsticks." Alessandro looked out the window of his hotel room at the main street of Millbrook. He could see the cultural center from here, could see people walking in for that evening's class. "Maybe that's exactly what I need to do," he said quietly, and hung up the phone. The truth was, something fundamental had shifted in Alessandro during these weeks. The man who had arrived in Millbrook full of arrogance and self-importance was gone. In his place was someone who was starting to understand what really mattered. He had watched young Danny, the farm boy, progress from barely being able to find middle C to playing simple melodies with genuine feeling. He had seen Ruth, the elderly woman with arthritis, light up every time she managed to play through an entire piece without stopping. He had witnessed shy teenagers find confidence through music, and lonely widowers find community in the weekly classes. And he had watched Margaret transform too. She had started the classes hesitant and unsure, but with each passing week she became more confident. She was a natural teacher, able to explain complex concepts in simple terms, able to encourage without coddling, able to see potential in people who didn't see it in themselves. One evening, after class, a young woman named Grace approached Margaret. Grace was 17, the daughter of the town's mechanic. She had been taking the classes but had been too shy to play in front of the group. "Mrs. Sullivan," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I talk to you about something?" They sat together on the bench after everyone else had left. Grace twisted her hands nervously. "I've been accepted to the state university. I got a partial scholarship. But my parents can't afford the rest, and I thought I'd just have to stay here and work at the diner. But then I found out the university has a music program, and they offer scholarships for students who show promise." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "Grace, that's wonderful. The thing is, I'd need to audition, and I don't know if I'm good enough. I've only been playing for 2 months. But you and Mr. Romano have made me love music so much, and I thought maybe, if I worked really hard, if you helped me prepare." She trailed off, looking hopeful and terrified at the same time. Margaret took Grace's hands in hers. She saw herself in this girl. The same hope, the same fear, the same desperate desire for music to be the answer to something. "Of course I'll help you," Margaret said. "We'll both help you." "When is the audition?" 3 months from now," Margaret smiled. "Then we have 3 months to get you ready." That night, Margaret told Thomas about Grace's situation. They were sitting on their porch, the same porch where they had spent countless quiet evenings over the years. But things felt different now. "Margaret felt different, I was thinking," she said carefully. "What if we got a piano? A real one. Not just for me, but so students like Grace could come practice here when the cultural center is closed. Some of them don't have pianos at home, and if they're going to improve, they need to practice." Thomas had been expecting this conversation. He had seen the change in his wife, had watched her come alive over the past 2 months in a way that made his heart full. "I've already been saving," he said. "And I talked to old Mr. Peterson. You know, he has that piano in his basement. His wife used to play before she passed. He said he'd sell it to us for a fair price, and he'll even help me move it." Margaret turned to stare at her husband. "You've been planning this?"